Now, every HTML element has properties which we call attributes. So for example, the elements that we've seen so far, the major heading, the paragraph, all of these have properties known as attributes. The syntax for defining an attribute is the name of the attribute followed by the value of the attribute. For example, if you want to define an attribute called ID for a div element, then this is how you would do it, where the value of the ID attribute is head ID. Now, attributes can be used in a multitude of ways, but there are three primary objectives that are most commonly used. The first one is to control the appearance of an element. The second one is to access an element uniquely within a document. And the third primary functionality of an attribute is to provide a suitable response based on a user action. So now let's look at some important attributes. So we have this example similar to the one we created in the last lab. So as you can see, we have a major heading as well as a paragraph. Now what we've done here is we've added an attribute called ID to both the major heading tag as well as the paragraph tag. The value of ID for the h1 element is active h1, whereas the value for the attribute ID for the paragraph element is active para. So let's just hit preview and see what the web page looks like. Well, it doesn't really look very different from what it would had the IDs not been there or had we not defined these attributes. So then what's so great? Well, if we bring the mouse pointer over the major heading element, as you can see, the pointer changes from its default shape to a hand, right? So that is one significant change that has happened. The other significant change is visible if you click on the H1 element. So what happens? If you click once, well, the paragraph disappears. You click again, the paragraph reappears. Well, how did that happen? Okay, so note that we have included a style sheet, right, in the head element, and we have also included a JavaScript file. So let's take a look at the JavaScript file. So once again, let's not get into the syntax of what this JavaScript does, but just note how the ID values that we defined in the HTML appear in this JavaScript, right? So here what we are doing is we are changing the style of the mouse pointer upon a certain action, okay, that basically refers to the user hovering over the heading element or bringing the mouse pointer over the heading element. And when that happens, the mouse pointer shape changes to a hand, as we saw. And in the second case, well, if you click on the heading element, the paragraph disappears, and you click again, the paragraph reappears. So once again, see how the value of the ID attribute that we defined for the paragraph appears here. Alright, so far so good. Let's move back to our HTML document and move on to the next step. So now let us learn about the class attribute. So we have included an attribute called ID. Let us include another attribute called class. So I could type in class equal to faded to the h1 element and class equal to faded to the paragraph element. So let's just save this and hit preview. So do you see what happened? Well, the text has grayed out a little bit. Now let's replace faded with dark in just the heading element. Let's save and hit preview. So now the heading is nice and dark, whereas the paragraph is still kind of grayed out. And how did that happen? Now to understand that, let us look at the CSS. Well, as you can see, we have defined two classes here, faded and dark, and we have played around with certain rules that control the way the text is displayed. So well, to summarize, in the earlier example, we saw an instance of how an element attribute provides a response based on user interaction or user action. And here we just saw how defining a certain attribute can alter the appearance of an element. Alright, so now let's move on to the next step where we shall learn about the title attribute. The title attribute acts as a tooltip, right? So for example, if you move your mouse pointer over an element, a small pop-up will come up and tell you whatever information you need to know. For example, let's see how it may work. So I add a title attribute and say this is a heading, right? So let's save this, let's hit preview, and when I move my mouse pointer over the heading element, you have this pop-up that comes up and says this is a heading. So this is a good way to show tips to visitors to your website when they move their mouse pointers over certain elements. And I'm sure this is something you must have encountered quite a few times. Now we can also change the visual style of an element by setting appropriate values to the style attribute. So far we've looked at the ID attribute, we've looked at the class attribute, we've looked at the title attribute. Now let us look at the style attribute. So I'm going to define a style attribute here and define or assign it a value of text transform uppercase. So let's save the file and let's hit preview. So well, what's happened here is that irrespective of the case you may have used while typing in the content of the heading element, the text transform uppercase value that you assign to the style attribute ensures that the heading content appears in block letters. This is an excellent example of where you can use the style attribute to alter the visual appearance of an element. So now it is time for you to experiment, right? Because the purpose of this particular lab was to introduce you to the concept of attributes, and as we said at the very first step, that there are three primary functions of using attributes, right? So let's recall what they were. The first one was to provide a suitable response based on a user action. The second one was to alter the appearance of an element. And the third one was to uniquely access an element inside an HTML document. We're going to learn more about the third use case as we go along this course, but we have suitably demonstrated the first two use cases. So just experiment to your heart's content and see how these various attributes can perform the two functionalities that have been covered in this lab.